Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This week I wanted to cover the various styles of decks that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has available for you to play rather than just doing another deck guide. So, aggro, control, combo, midrange, this is a series of terms taken from Magic the Gathering lingo that have also been applied to Yu-Gi-Oh! For many years. And yet the Yu-Gi-Oh! Player base has never really been able to nail down definitions for these terms as far as our game goes. The game is just so different from Magic and from most other TCGs that the terms are used nebulously and people will routinely refer to the same deck with different styles. More recently, it feels like maybe the player base has started to use these a little bit more consistently, and so I wanted to document what each means for new player reference. So with that, let's get started. First up, and most importantly, why does any of this matter? Why do we need to categorize various decks and playstyles in the first place? Well, the importance is threefold. Firstly, it lets players know if they would like a deck at a glance. If you say enjoy control, then knowing that Fiendsmith is a control archetype lets you see at a glance that you might be interested in it, and you might avoid a combo-centric deck like Virtual World. The second reason is that for a new player, understanding what your deck type is can help you make good gameplay decisions. If you understand that you're playing an aggro deck, something like Skull Servants, then even if you don't have every matchup memorized, or even if you don't know your own deck very well for that matter, you still know that you may have to take extra risks to end a game quickly since you do not do well in the long run. And the last reason is that it lets us communicate effectively as a community. In particular, it lets us talk about why game balance is the way it is. It takes a lot of words to explain, well, Fiendsmith is ubiquitous because it's a completely generic archetype that doesn't lock you into anything and adds recursion to any deck it's in to help with grindier games. Whereas it would be a lot simpler if everyone simply understood what "it's a small generic control engine" means at a glance. So this seems like a good time to talk about the term control. In Magic, this refers to a deck style that focuses on stopping an opponent's actions to draw out a game and win with greater resource generation. In Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a bit harder to nail down the term because every deck is trying to stop the opponent from playing, so we can omit that part of the definition and focus on the rest. In Yu-Gi-Oh! A control deck is thus a deck that prefers longer matches where it can beat opponents with greater resource generation. This often comes in the form of reusable resources, also known as recursion. Taking Fiendsmith here as an example, the deck can renew resources from the graveyard every turn while putting key pieces back into the deck and extra deck to reuse them. That means that when a Fiendsmith player reaches their second turn, they can accrue a ton of advantage that the opponent may not have access to, and that can cinch the victory for them. That's the win-con of a control deck in general, is to generate enough resources to keep going as long as you need to run the opponent out of their own resources. Control decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Do have a weakness though, well at least they do when they're healthy decks, and that is that they generate a limited number of disruptions. Due to the focus on that resource generation, the cards that they use just don't tend to have enough room to put 6 to 10 negations on the board like a combo deck will. Fiendsmith here will put an effective 2 to 4 disruptions on board uninterrupted, and that's enough to slow the opponent down but not completely shut them out. That means that a high power going second deck can probably blow through their end board with ease and beat them before they can gain their advantage. Since resource generation can often include card draw, control decks will often, but not always, supplement their disruptions with a ton of hand traps, counter traps, and or floodgates. Something like Pure Punk would be an example of a control deck that focuses on drawing cards, hoping to augment a fairly weak end board with a ton of hand traps. Conversely, Branded is a control deck with a very high engine count that can't play a ton of hand traps and focuses more on the recursion aspect of control. If a Branded player makes it to their second turn, you can probably consider the game over. Other control examples include things like Trap Tricks, Azamina, and Regenesis. In my opinion, control archetypes are the most desired engines to splash into other deck styles in order to gain that power of recursion, and that explains why Fiendsmith has been such a mainstay since its initial release. Any deck that can't reuse their own resources can slap Fiendsmith in there to gain the power of control. Thus, I personally consider splashable control archetypes a problem, and I think they're a lot more healthy if they have strong locks to keep the splashability in check. Otherwise, why even bother playing a pure control deck if you can just use the engine in a combo deck and have the best of both worlds? On the subject of combo decks, you may ask, isn't every Yu-Gi-Oh deck a combo deck? And indeed, nearly every deck is trying to pull off a combo to some degree. In Magic, that would be enough to consider them combo decks, but in Yu-Gi-Oh I think we need to be a bit more specific. I consider a combo deck to be one that focuses entirely on creating a powerful, nigh-invulnerable end board or other win condition. A combo deck wants 10 or more disruptions, or just a couple of unbeatable ones, and it's willing to sacrifice recursion and play extra bricks and one-ofs in order to make that happen. Thus, they tend to jump across multiple archetypes and have low room for non-engine. A good example of a combo deck is something like Mermail here, which includes a bunch of different archetypes that play well together to make a deck that ends on a board that is incredibly difficult to crack, but has little recourse if you manage to actually do so, since their individual pieces don't do much outside of the context of a greater combo, and they tend to use a lot of these single-use cards on their first turn. Other examples of combo decks would include things like Lunalight, Memento, and various FTK strategies like Exodia Turbo Draw. Combo decks are interesting in that they rarely stick to a single archetype, and when they do, it's because that archetype has strong locks on it. So Lunalight will use various Beast Warrior support cards and a ton of Xyz monsters even though it's a fusion deck. Memento will play Fiendsmith since it tends to end with extra bodies and can turn them into recursion. There are exceptions like Speedroid here, where it's definitely a combo deck, but it has such strong locks that it can't really use outside help. Decks like that are the ones I feel like are most vulnerable to power creep, which is unfortunate because these decks tend to be fan favorites, like combo decks that are very centered on their own game plan. But they can't implement new support and adjust to changing game conditions as well as other deck types. They are sure fun to go off with, though. Next up is the Aggro deck. In Magic, these are decks focused on beating the opponent as fast as possible at the cost of any recursion, card synergy, or even really a coherent strategy a lot of the time. In Yu-Gi-Oh, these decks tend to instead be called Going Second or OTK, One Turn Kill, decks. These are relatively rare since interaction in Yu-Gi-Oh is so crazy that a deck has to be very powerful or very unfair in order to crack a fully established board and win on the same turn. My favorite example of an aggro deck is Skull Servants. They focus entirely on putting 10, 20, 30,000 attack worth of little guys on the field and swinging for the fences. They generate no disruptions, have little recursion, and don't have a specific combo, but man are they good at killing people. Other examples include things like Gimmick Puppets, Ancient Gears, and of course, Tenpai. Aggro decks are almost always either the most obnoxious, unfair thing someone can be doing, or completely toothless. There's a reason all three of the above examples have cards that effectively say the opponent cannot interact with you in any way. That's because cards like that are often the only way a going second strategy can fend off a wall of negates and destructions. But they can often prey on slower, grindier control decks with a good hand, since the control decks have less ways to stop the beatdown. Speaking of obnoxious, I guess I should briefly cover stun decks. In Magic terms, we call these prison decks, and it's obvious why. The goal is to prevent the opponent from even being able to play the game at all. In that way, you could consider these a subtype of the control deck, but on the opposite strategy, focused on removing all of the opponent's resources rather than generating their own. They do this with lots and lots of floodgates and other quote-unquote unfair cards that restrict the plays available to the opponent. Because they need a critical mass of disruption, they tend to have little to no room for hand traps, and thus suffer greatly going second, but have an incredibly high win rate going first where they can set up before the opponent can get going. Examples of archetypes include Dinomorphia, Monarchs, and the new Morganite stuff, but stun is often non-archetypal and simply picks and chooses the best pieces to make an unholy abomination. Lastly, we have Midrange Decks. This is the most nebulous term even in the Magic community, where it refers to decks simply playing good cards. Midrange is focused on bang for your buck. A decently statted creature that draws you a card, that's mid-range. They kind of exist halfway between control and aggro, hence the name. The goal is simply to outvalue the opponent, but in Yu-Gi-Oh! That's what a control deck does. So while personally I'm not sure we even need the term here, I suppose you could say it's placed somewhere between control and combo. A good example is Vanquish Soul. This is an archetype that doesn't necessarily have a ton of recursion, but it generates resources as it plays to maybe not keep up entirely with a control deck, but keeps up well enough to pressure them while playing more of its own disruptions. They sometimes have to choose between a resource like a card draw and a disruption, which makes them probably the most skill-intensive style of deck. Other examples could include things like Dragon Maids and Centurion. Both have recursion and disruption, but aren't necessarily hyper-focused on one over the other. And that's it. While those are all of the purest styles of deck, remember that depending on how you build a deck, its style can change drastically. Drytron here can be combo, control, going second, or even stun depending on how you build it. While that's an extreme example, the point stands that even if pure Fiendsmith is control, Fiendsmith, Azumina, Kashtira, 420 Snake Eyes is a combo deck for certain. The point is just to identify what you're playing, what your win condition is, and play towards that. If you as the combo player hold resources too long, you might let the control player get some recursion online and they'll win in the grind game, so you have to try for a total shutout as an example. Remember to play to your strengths and you should do alright. Cool? Cool.